Our next speaker is Dr. David Skarbek on the economics of prison gangs. Dr. David Skarbek is a lecturer in political economy in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. He received a PhD in economics at George Mason University, after which he taught at the Department of Political Science at Duke University. He has previously presented at TEDx event, and his academic articles have been published in numerous journals, including the American Political Science Review, Journal of Law, Economics and Organisation, and Public Choice. He is the author of The Social Order of the Underworld, How Prison Gangs Govern the American Penal System. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to the IEA and IHS. This is a fantastic event that I'm very pleased to be able to take part in. The United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, and with one minor exception, a greater rate of its population than any other country. To give some perspective, the US holds fewer than 5% of the world's population, but more than 20% of the world's prisoner population, so disproportionately large amount. Even when compared to sort of comparable countries, the US isn't just a little bit more excessive in its prison use, it's dramatically more excessive. The US locks up about 700 out of every 100,000 resident. Compared to every other OECD country, they are just far and away much more punitive, much more likely to send people to prison. So one of the beauties of economics is that economics can explain not just how traditional markets work, but economics can also explain why this is the case. It can explain what are some of the social consequences of locking up so many people. And then what I'd like to talk about today is economics can help explain what changes about the way that prisons work when you incarcerate so many people. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite you to think about what it would be like to live in an American prison, to be incarcerated in America. I'd like you to think about how you would stay safe. How would you ensure that you are safe while locked up in an American prison? You might hope or assume that prison officials will guarantee your safety. It's certainly their job to do so. They work very hard at it. But whenever we study prisons in just about any country and at any time, we find that people who are incarcerated don't rely only on officials for safety and for governance. They have to seek out some other safety. The very bars that keep you locked in your cell at night are one source of safety for you. Because you're locked in, predatory inmates are locked out. So that's some source of safety. But what we find is that inmates organize amongst themselves because the guards and the bars that prisons provide are insufficient to meet inmates' needs, to meet their demands. And the main reason for that is because officials don't provide enough help in two key ways. The first is safety. Even when prison officials are very effective at their jobs, many inmates feel vulnerable. They feel concerned, and they're concerned that somebody who is incarcerated in the prison will try to harm them. This is a picture of an overcrowded dormitory in a state prison in California from several years ago. How would you feel if you lived here? The room holds 150 to 250 men. Probably 3 or 4 correctional officers or prison guards there to ensure your safety. But throughout the day, when you're taking a nap, when you're spending time with your associates, getting a haircut, you're very much exposed to the whims and the actions of the other men who are locked up with you. Prisons in the United States have become dramatically safer in the last 40 years. Riots like this one are much less frequent, but they still happen. If you lived in an environment where these large-scale disruptions, where chaotic acts of pretty serious violence might happen, it seems very reasonable to me that you would spend some time and some energy, invest some resources to protect yourself should something like this happen, but also to try to prevent these things from happening in the first place. The second reason why inmates develop governance, or they organize themselves in ways that officials don't aid them in doing so, is because officials won't regulate economic activity in the underground economy. These are some of the thousands of mobile phones confiscated from inmates in California, and every single one of them is contraband. It's prohibited. They're not allowed to have them. In addition to phones, many inmates have a substantial demand for drugs, alcohol, tobacco, a wide range of other goods and services that prison rules say they're not allowed to have. In order to get these items, inmates have to rely on the underground economy and the activity of other prison entrepreneurs. The problem with that is the illegality of the market necessarily comes with the inability to rely on formal procedures to resolve disputes that are bound to arise. If you do a drug deal and the quantity or the quality of the heroin that you get isn't what you expected, you can't turn to the prison guard and ask him to fix it for you. So the inability, because of the illegality to rely on officials, means that there's this gap in social order, there's this gap in governance that inmates find ways to solve themselves. Whenever we study prisons, to varying degrees, inmates self-organize. And the state of California, in its historical experience, provides a very useful opportunity to study extra-legal governance, governance outside of formal procedures. And the reason why is because what we know about life in California prisons allows us to understand where institutions come from, how they work, and how they evolve or change over time. So what I'd like to do is talk briefly about two periods of life in California prisons to understand why we have prison gangs and how inmates satisfy a need for order. If you were incarcerated in California prior to the 1960s, the main way that you would stay safe would be by adhering to what's come to be called the Convict Code. The Convict Code is a set of behaviors and norms. And to the extent that you followed these behaviors, which mainly guided your interactions with other inmates, to the extent that you followed them, you'd be in good standing amongst your peers, amongst other inmates. That good standing would mean that you would have access to their resources, they would offer the mutual support or the peer support that you might need, and it means that you'd be much more likely to be victimized by other inmates. So what exactly did this code encourage? Never to inform on other inmates. Never to be overly nosy, not to gossip or to lie or to steal from other inmates. The Convict Code told you to pay back your debts if you go into debt. Told you not to be weak and not to whine and complain about the difficult experience that you're in. So people who followed these rules were esteemed by their peers and were relatively safe. And by contrast, people who violated these things, by the nature of these norms, caused problems. When you lie, when you steal, when you fail to repay debts, that causes conflicts with other inmates. So that conflict, the violations of those norms, would lead you to have a low status, and it means that people didn't want to support you in problems that arose, and it means that you'd be much more likely to be victimized. This system of governance is remarkably decentralized. There was no committee that decided that these are the acceptable behaviors or not. They didn't write these down and then distribute them to other inmates. Enforcement of these norms was entirely decentralized. It was up to individual inmates to decide whether or not to punish someone for violations of these rules or not. This Convict Code worked incredibly effectively, and it worked because people knew each other's social standing. And the concern about losing that standing provided a reason why you should adhere to the norms that the code dictates. Prisons in California today look very different. They don't rely on the Convict Code, they rely on something entirely different. And the reason why is because of changes in inmate demographics. The size of prisons, the size of the prison system began to increase and eventually increased fairly dramatically. And that meant that inmates didn't have the ability to know most people's social standing. And if you don't know other people's social standing, then there's less incentive for you to not lie and to not to steal, because people won't know that you're a liar and a thief. So this is some data starting from 1851, when the state of California first began. And through 1920, the number of people in prison each year is always relatively low, fewer than 5,000 people. There's growth during that period, but it's fairly slow and stable. From 1920 through 1970, we see a roughly five-fold increase in the size of the prison population to an unprecedented level, and it's driven by a more sustained and rapid growth than in any previous period. The Convict Code worked very effectively when there were low and steady growth in the inmate population. But if you were in prison in California during the 1950s and 1960s, you'd very clearly identify two trends. There would be more strangers who you lived among, more people who you didn't know very well and who didn't know you. And secondly, what's been documented by prison officials during this period is that during that increase in the prison population, it corresponds with a dramatic increase in inmate-on-inmate violence, and in particular, inmate stabbings. There's much more violence taking place during this period, and the reason for that is that the code is becoming less effective. That violence is an indication of the fact that this governance is becoming less effective. So, to give a little more historical breadth, that's the same data we looked at on the last slide, but when we allow the data to continue to the present, we see an even more dramatic increase in the number of people that California incarcerates, over 100,000 year after year after year. A decentralized system based on norms, the Convict Code, can work effectively when populations are small. But as they failed and violence increased, inmates sought out alternatives. And what they turned to was organizations that have come to be called prison gangs. And for the reasons that I'll tell you next, these prison gangs are very skilled at providing governance, at establishing order in large prison populations. Prison gangs are inmate organizations that begin behind bars. They operate in prisons, sometimes out in the community. Membership in these groups is mutually exclusive, such that you can be a member of one gang, but not more than one at the same time. There's a permanence to these, so that individuals like this gentleman will continue to work for the gang even after they leave prison. In fact, there's a lifetime commitment. And finally, membership in a prison gang is restrictive, such that not just anybody can join such a gang. In California, if you were locked up in California today, the main source of order, these prison gangs, would have a dramatic influence on your day-to-day interactions from the moment that you wake up in the morning to the moment that you go to bed at night. What you can do and do will be monitored and dictated by the prison gang leaders, the shot callers of this prison gang system. The way that the gangs work, I call a community responsibility system. And a community responsibility system works in the following way. Everyone in prison has to affiliate with some group. That's often a prison gang, sometimes it's a broader racial or ethnic group. But what defines these groups is that within a group, each person's actions and obligations, all other group members are responsible for. So to give an example, if you're a member of the gang on the left and you incur a debt to a member of the group on the right, not only are you responsible for its repayment, but everyone in your group is responsible for its repayment. In a situation like that, the gang leader from your group, the shot caller, will most likely meet with the shot caller or the gang leader of the other organization and negotiate how to resolve that collective responsibility. It might be that your gang forces you to collect funds from friends and family members. It might be that the gang pays it off for you. Very often, your own gang would assault you in a controlled way, but to the satisfaction that the rival gang leader feels that a message has been sent that non-repayment of debts is unacceptable behavior. One inmate explains the system as follows. He says, that's why we have shot callers. So when a couple of idiots get into it in the yard, when they have a dispute, instead of letting them kill themselves, the shot caller goes out and he works it out. The shot callers are responsible for problems that arise, especially between different groups. Instead of relying on decentralized enforcement of rules, gangs write down their rules, and they designate people to monitor and enforce the rules, usually the gang leaders, the gang shot callers. Another inmate explains how the community responsibility system works. He says, if one of my guys is messing up, then we either offer him up to the other guys to be assaulted, or we take him down ourselves. There's tremendous in-group pressure in order to facilitate inter-group pressure. These shot callers have rules and enforce rules about economic activity. You have to repay your debts, but also about social actions. You can't use certain mean words to describe certain members of other groups, for example. And if you do, very often you have to go and apologize to that person for saying those hurtful words. The advantage of this system in a large prison population is that gangs are experts at monitoring behavior, collecting information. The gang shot callers spend a tremendous amount of time trying to watch out, trying to decide what people should do, and punishing people who they think have done badly. Whereas in the previous system, an individual standing was key. In this system, by contrast, it's the group that is key. So you don't have to know every individual person's social standing, you simply have to know every group's standing to whether to punish them through your disapprobation. And if you have a more serious problem, then you can go directly to the shot callers. There's someone who's responsible for controlling their group's members. Gangs don't provide this because they're altruistic or because they generally care about other people. They do it because facilitating stability and order through regulation increases the profits that they make selling drugs in the underground economy. One inmate explains, he says, "We don't fight in a riot unless we have to. If I'm locked down, then I'm not working. You can make some serious bank in prison, and shot callers hate it when you're in lockdown." So it's actually this profit incentive that leads gang leaders to provide a degree of stability and order and to reduce some violence in California prisons today. Even though there's some positive aspect to what gangs do, gangs are clearly a problem. They undermine rehabilitation, they increase recidivism, they hamper the administration of a prison substantially. So if you were going to be in prison and you didn't want to live under the rules and the control and authority of prison gangs, what should we do? How can we reform prisons? My argument is that people form gangs because gangs provide safety in a dangerous environment. So one way to make gangs less desirable to inmates is to make inmates safer. Why are gangs so important today, even though they didn't exist for more than a century in California? I think it goes to the size of the prisons, the size of the prison population. Gangs aren't just good at providing protection, but they're especially good at providing protection in large prisons. Officials find large prisons very difficult to monitor and to control and to protect inmates in. Smaller prisons are easier to monitor, and when inmates need governance that officials don't provide, they're less likely to turn to gangs to do it. And as the data behind me shows, in men's prisons in California, the average size of those prisons is nearly 3,500 inmates, whereas in this country, it's just over 700. By the way, there's no similar prison gang situation in this country. And when you look at the Scandinavian countries where there's no such thing as prison gangs, those prisons are even smaller. Smaller prisons are easier to control, so inmates have less need for other inmates to provide order. The United States is an extreme outlier in its use of prisons, and it's also an extreme outlier in having organized prison gangs operate in many of its state facilities. So these are two areas of American exceptionalism, and they're not unrelated. Big prisons lead to a problem of prison gangs. So when we think about prison reform, there's lots of problems with many prison systems, but at least in California, we need to remember that the problem with prison gangs, the problem that gives rise to them, is big prisons. So thanks very much.